If you think your thoughts and opinions do not matter, or if you fear taking the next steps towards a better you, or if you allow other people to take free reign of your life, now is the time to put an end to these limiting beliefs. Welcome to Change Your View, a podcast that will help you take back control to have a well-lived life and the conviction that your life is to have meaning. Join Hasina Shahid Jackson in discussions aimed at overcoming the limitations of physical sight to see with spirit, hope, and faith. Each episode will empower you to develop the courage and self-assurance to go after the life you want. Here is your host, Hasina.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome today for another episode of Change Your View. Today, I have an interesting guest. I met her maybe about, 4 or 5 months ago, and we just immediately had a connection. And it's Amanda Johnson, and she is the story oracle. And what is so amazing is that she really helps individuals to understand their identity in terms of letting them take their own journey through writing a story. So, Amanda, let's just get right into it, because I think I would really like people to understand, what does it mean and how do you define your own identity?
One of those small little questions, right?
You said, why don't we just jump right in, right?
Dive in. No, I love these deep conversations. I'm one of those people that I go into regular social situations and I'm just talk about something real, like identity or story or something. So I'm always grateful for these conversations. So I think, as we've been talking, just connecting over time, we've had a few conversations about identity and how I've been interacting with it through story. Because as most people, when you go from that ordinary world of the home that you grew up in, which has all of its cultural values and all of its possibly the religious values, right? And then you move into the not so ordinary world, everything gets challenged, right? That identity that was formed, that perception of who we are in relationship to everything and everybody else. That's how I would define identity. What is our self-perception and our role in relationship to whatever you call it, God, the universe. I call it my co-author. And also to the systems in which you find yourself, whether that's a family system or a workplace or an actual organization system. What is the identity that is either thrust upon you that you find yourself, having to live into, or what is the one that, if you get the opportunity, that you would create for yourself? And that's where I usually find people in the process of trying to share their stories.
And you've said an interesting point that I want to touch upon, because a lot of times we don't allow ourselves to form our own identity. Instead, we want to be conformers. And so you actually shared an interesting story with me about your son. And I know he's the co-author with you on a book, but I would like for you to talk about too, where you allowed him to take his own journey to find what religion meant to him.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I want you to share a little bit of that, because you had your parents who really tried to intercede in some way, but you said, no, wait a minute. And I love when he asked you a question about the Bible too. And so I just want you to share that with me, because I think a lot of times we get stuck in that we have to follow the path of someone else, when we really should pave our own way.
Yeah. Well, I think even before I share that story with you, I think one of the things for me around identity is that it's very rare to find a person who has shaped their own from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because our identity gets formed from the time that we're born. And so the family that we step into, the cultural values, the religious values, all of those shape who we are unconsciously. Often, I think the time frame that I've heard is by 7, you've pretty much wired in some of your essential beliefs about the world around you and about, whether it's good or evil or safe or not. And so when we think in those terms, we're kind of raised to conform, right? And to survive in a family system, we have to abide by the rules, even if there's some part of us that goes, something is clearly not right here. It might be something that they're telling us is right or wrong, but sometimes it's just something's happening. And, or it might be, then we go into the education system, and that's also not set up to be, hey, who do you want to be in this world? Yes, you get those questions, but the way it's executed is you sit at your desk, you listen to the expert, you regurgitate what you've heard, and that's how you survive in that system and get the marks and get on to the next system that you have to do the same thing. Learn the game, leverage the game as much as you can. And so I think it's rare for people to have a moment where something happens, the hero's journey, like an inciting incident, a tragedy happens or an adventure is offered, right? And you think like, something can change right now. And we all get those. Tragedies befall us, opportunities cross our paths. Like, even if they're small, we get these little moments where we could. But if we don't have someone with us who says, who do you want to be now?
Correct.
Then we just continue being who we were before, right? And learning the next game instead of, what if I could create the rules of the game? Which is why I love entrepreneurship, because one thing that it taught me, and I did not plan to be an entrepreneur. I was going to be a journalist and work for a newspaper. I was going to be an educator and work for a system. Like, I was not planning on being an entrepreneur. It happened to me. And I realized the gift of it was that I didn't have to deal with anyone else's limits but mine. Like,
Yeah.
I could do anything I wanted. I could create it, right?
Right.
So
I like that.
The limits were just mine.
But you raised, and we have to go back to the original question, but I just want to piggyback on what you said, is that our experiences in our life, we have to determine how we will internalize them to add to our identity, or will we allow them to put us on the path where we have no ownership of our identity. So the thing is, we have that autonomous ability to determine who we can become based on the things that happen us into society. But like you said, when you're a child and you're growing up, you don't really have the moments where you get to choose. Because I think about, I just was yesterday just having a conversation with my sister, because I was raised as a Muslim. And for me, I was maybe 4 or 5 years old when my family converted to Islam. But my sister, though, was a teenager. And so, but she suffered because she was ridiculed. And my parents took her out of public school to put her in the Islamic school, where she did not excel the way that she could have, because of the fact that it was something new and they were creating their own schooling system. And I don't knock Islam. So in any way, I don't want anybody to think that. But my point of this is saying that parents can dictate what their children do to their own detriment. And she was saying to me, I lost a lot in my childhood because I had to follow the path of mom and dad instead of really being able to grow into the religion that I wanted. And now she's a Christian like myself today. But the point is that your children suffer, or whoever suffers, when you try to dictate who they should become and who they should follow and what they should think and believe. When you really should give them that chance of having conversations like you did with your son to say, well, what do you think? What do you believe in? And letting them go find those truths. Because when you force truths down another person, then what happens is that it starts to limit their thinking. Well, they'll look for someone else always to tell them what they should think and believe, versus them finding the answers themselves to what is they should add in terms to their character. But,
exactly.
So I want to go back to the thing about your son and how it really started on how you allowed him to form his own, because I think that this example is a perfect example for people in all walks of life, not just for children, but anyone who needs to decide on what is the truth for them to add to their identity.
Yeah. And I would say that my relationship with my son was just the beginning of me figuring out how to do this. Because when you're raised in a system that dictates it's all you know how to do, then you get put in a position of authority, and how do you do anything different than what you've already always seen done? Right. So there I was, 23 years old, fresh out of an honors program where I learned everything about Socratic method and story, got my teaching credential. And I have this little baby in front of me, and I have no religious structure under me anymore, because even though I still believed in God and felt like I had so many experiences, I had so many miracles that I witnessed throughout my teens, but I had been wrestling with this conversation about how much power does God have and how much power do we have? Because where I was raised, like, God takes care of everything. And so people would not live responsibly and end up in terrible pieces. And I think we should be doing more. But then I went to the other side where I was like, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to do it. Right. And so I've been in this wrestling match, and then here comes this little kid, and I'm like, I don't know, how does one raise a happy, healthy human who's responsible without like a religious structure and like the 10 commandments, the moral dictates, like this is what it means to be a good human. Like, but I had enough child development and psychology and curriculum development underneath me as a educated person that I could say, okay, I'm going to try this. And so for me, every decision I made was an attempt to preserve his agency. So what I knew was that at 23, my body was suffering. I could not connect to my emotions. My relationships were a mess. I couldn't figure out what I was going to do with my life career-wise. And I felt like a lot of this was because of what we've been talking about. Other people had decided what my life was going to look like.
Mhm.
And these weren't malevolent people. They had all the best intentions. They wanted me to thrive and grow. They gave me the absolute best that they could see. And then the way that they gave it to me was that they gave it to me and assumed that would be my thing, instead of saying, hey, what do you think about this? So when Aaron came, I decided I was going to do it different. And I, of course, disrupted the system pretty significantly. I told my family and my husband's family, because they were all, religious background. I said, look, we've been on a journey, and it's not like we don't believe a lot of what you do, but I really want this child to choose his path as it relates to deciding who God is and who he is in relationship to God and the world. And so I asked them to please not sing songs that would get stuck in his head, or read stories as if they were the absolute literal truth, or proselytize him, evangelize him in any way. Just don't share like as it's the truth until he asks you. And then when he asks you, share what you believe as if it's not the only thing that anyone can ever believe. These were tall orders for these folks. Tall orders. I realize that.
Because that requires humility. Because it requires humility in terms of, you have to say that my perspective is not the only perspective. And also be open, be teachable, because we're always teachable. For me, I'm always teachable until the day I die. And so you also have to be loving and be empathetic. So if they had to be all those things to your son in order for him to take his journey, that was for him.
Why would they do that to a 2-year-old? Like, right? I mean, I was really asking them to do something that was so off their grid. And so he was about 2 or 3 years old, I want to say, comes home from Nana's house and is like, so why don't we have a Bible? And my fork drops on my plate because I'm just like, these people, they just cannot follow my requests. And I'm over there trying not to throw a full tantrum in front of my kid, and my husband interjects and he says, well, we do have a Bible right now. Right now, our Bible is Avatar: The Last Airbender, which was a Nickelodeon cartoon. Now, we had a Bible in the house. It was, part of practices and everything, but I wasn't introducing it to him yet. In my book, he wasn't ready for that. So my husband said, it's Avatar: The Last Airbender. That's our sacred text right now. And I was like, you are an absolute genius, because I had just spent 4.5 years in a classic books program, wrestling with author intention and themes and ideas and stories and characters, and like, why are these people writing this for this time? And why is it here? Why is it crossing our path right now? And so I began to get very intentional, which was great because look, I was basically just about physically and emotionally crippled in my early 20s. So I did not have energy like a healthy young mom to go to the park and run out all the energy. I did not have the energy to clean up an art mess at the end of a project. Like our life was very small because my capacity was so small. So story was like the thing I could do. I was already falling asleep on the couch in all of my exhaustion while he was watching movies. So I decided, okay, I'm going to use this. And so we started to use story as a way to have conversations about the most important things in life, about, what happens when uncertainty comes, when that inciting incident happens to a character. What does that look like? I remember one of the very first stories that we talk about in A Religion of Story is Finding Nemo. And I remember watching that movie and watching Marlin, the dad, and he's just like so scared, but Nemo's like, I'm going to school. And I was like, this is exactly where I'm at right now with Aaron, because he at 3 had just looked outside of our car one day, seen a bus and said, I'm ready for school, Mom.
Okay.
And I was like, I am not ready for school yet, son. I'm not ready to let you go. And so I understood Marlon, the dad, who was like, it's scary out there. Because, all my stuff comes up, all my identity comes up, and I'm about ready to put that on him and maybe keep him from school for a few more years because I don't want him to experience the pain that I went through, instead of sitting with him in a movie and saying, how could he have done this better? Like, clearly it's not a good idea to go so far away from your parent that you get kidnapped and taken on an adventure that you might not come back from. But what were some of the good qualities? And how could, if I behaved differently than that parent and I went with you on this journey, how could we take that adventure together? And so it really was always a constant invitation to talk about characters and what they were facing. What would we do if we were them? And how did we think that story was going to end? And yeah, eventually, it just became part of the soup that we lived in. It's what we did together. We just loved all of the stories.
I love that. Let's go back a little bit because you've said hinted to it a couple of different times, and I know someone might want to know. So tell me what caused you to be such a mess? What was causing this downness that you were experiencing?
I think that, well, there were a few things, layers upon layers, as it happens with the identity. So the first layer was that things that happened in my childhood that were just hard. And every time I tried to bring it up, address it, I was just told, you're too much, basically. Like, they didn't have the emotional capacity to sit with me in all of my fear and anger and demands. I mean, I saw a letter, I must have written it when I was 8, and I just laid it out for my dad. I was like, you need to stop, blah, 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 blah. And I'm tired of this and that. And I remember reading it and thinking, where did this girl go? I mean, she was a fire. She was amazing. But there was a clue. After everything that I said, I would say, I'm tired of this. I would also say, I'm sorry. I felt like I always had to apologize for who I was, basically. My feelings, my responses to the world was clearly being a giant inconvenience to the adults around me. Now, really amazing parents doing their absolute best, working their butts off, like to the world, and even to me looking back, like I had a really great case scenario. There were no giant traumas, but there were enough of these little things that chipped away at me feeling like my voice mattered, my feelings mattered, that it was okay for me to hold people accountable to a standard that of treating me that I wanted, And so I just realized early on, like, I'm going to have to pretend not to be me here because
yeah. I get what you're saying. It's interesting that you say that because I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, And he was saying, and his parents wasn't malicious when they did this, but they always told him, you're shy and you're not outgoing. And so those kind of words imprinted upon his mind so that he became to believe that, and it limited him. So as
Yep.
he grew up to be an adult, all he wanted to do was go into the back room and fade into the woodwork because all he kept hearing was, you're shy, you're not outgoing. And so he took that as he should just be invisible.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
so he told this to his parents, and his parents did not mean that in a malicious way. They just meant that in a way to try to maybe build him up.
Mhm.
But we have to look at the words that we say to the
Yes.
people around us, because what we're saying in our minds appear to be one way. However, when you're speaking into the mind of someone that maybe it does not have that high self-esteem, especially as a child, a child that then you're programming them to think that those are the things that they are. So he had to grow up and really get his own identity to say, I'm not shy.
Mhm.
I'm not an introvert. I'm really an extrovert, and I like people. I like to have relationships. And he moved on to have a business where he's really dealing with people every day.
Yep.
So the point is that, to what you were just saying, is that your parents did not mean, or anyone around you didn't mean to really put that on your mind, but they did, because that's what, as you're growing up, you're forming your own identity.
Yep.
And you telling someone that is adding to the person that they see when they look in the mirror.
Exactly. And you don't know until you're older usually that your parents were kids once too. And they also went through things. And depending on what generation you live in, sometimes they went through some really awful things. And so I didn't know at the time all of the trauma that they were just like barely living on top of while they were trying to give me better, right?
Right.
Until I went and I hung out with my grandma and I was like, oh, shoot, this explains so much of what I experienced as a kid, but it was already done,
Mhm.
right? The impact was already made, and I already had an identity that I needed to rewrite. I needed to own in a way of, this is the past, this is the backstory. But what's this character going to end up doing? Who are they going to end up being at the end of this story? And they can't use the same scripts and behaviors and approaches that the last generation did, because it's just going to create more of this. And so, like you were saying, this really good intentions. My parents, I mean, I was a high performer from the time I was young in school. I was such a good student, and I just got praised and praised and praised. And oh, look at your big sister. She's just knocking out of the, part. Like, I was elevated for my performance, which was fantastic. And then I would have these moments where I would be not performing, or not feeling like I could perform, or those sorts of things. And I wasn't getting the type of attention that would help me move back to that. So what I ended up learning was my performance was tied to my worthiness of time, attention,
Mhm.
praise, right? So
Yeah.
I learned these essential things about worth that got me into a lot of trouble, man. I mean, I high performed myself into some severe adrenal burnout and fibromyalgia in my early 20s. I high performed myself there. And
Yes.
so that was one of those things that I was like, I'm going to change this for Aaron. I'm going to figure out how to disconnect this, worth and responsibility, worth and performance thing. And I would say to him, the words were important. And that's why I was always about the words with the adults in his life. Everyone knew that it was a cardinal sin to call my son a bad boy.
I love
I
that.
mean, I promised consequences.
I
I
love
didn't know
that.
what they would be, because, that mama tiger, that's like, I don't know what I'm about to do in this moment, but I'm about to do something crazy, because I know the damage that you did by calling him bad, instead of saying, I don't think that was a great choice.
Correct.
You, amazing human, I see you trying to get something. This thing that you're doing over here to get it, that is not the way to go about this. Let me show you how.
Because it's the
And
words
so
that you speak, because that's what he's
it
going
was
to
the
think. I'm
words.
a bad boy.
It was the
So,
words.
so how did he decide upon his religion? So let's go to that. So he asked about the Bible. You start doing the stories with me. So what was the turning point for him?
Well, we talked about it all the time. We watched different stories with different religious contexts. And I remember one time where I was starting to get a hint because it would come up, but it was not necessarily like, well, what do you believe about this? I would never push him. I wanted to wait until he was ready to say something that would be like an invitation
Okay.
because it's such a precious, it's to me, it's like the most important thing to decide. Right. And so I remember we were watching a show called God Friended Me. Do you remember that? It was about a young man who, such a good show, super cheesy in its execution and writing and acting sometimes. But like that, the point of the show was so cool. It's this young man who kept getting friend requests on Facebook. And so he eventually realized that God was setting him up with people so that he could help them or they could help him. So it was like this, using modern technology to talk about something that I see, in my story and every story I work on constantly, which is people show up at the just right time, the mentors, the allies, the resources. And so it was a really cool show about that. And I remember that we finished one night and it was a really moving episode. And he said, "You know what is so great about this show? It's so cheesy." But and he must have been like 15 or 16 and this was my first clue it was happening. This really is based on the idea that life is happening for you, not to you.
That was, I know
Now,
that is a long pause, because that's what people need to understand.
15 to
Yes.
have that perspective
Yes.
that even the hard stuff. I mean, we watched plenty of story. We had been through plenty of story. We had a grandma with dementia that we navigated caregiving with. This child's life was not, it was not silver spoon anything. It was hard. But still at 15, after all of that, he would say, this is the better way of looking at life, as if it's all happening for you and not to you.
Well,
He understood that even the lens of that
yes.
would change somebody's life. And so that was like the
Yeah.
first thing of, well, if that's happening for you, not to you, then who's working in charge of that? Like who's creating those opportunities? Who's orchestrating? And in the background, I'm doing
Yes.
what I promised. Here's what I promised when I walked out of the church. And I was fighting with people. I mean, I burned some bridges, okay? Because I was wrestling out doctrine. I was like, if this is true, then this can't be true. I mean, it was not pretty. And I remember this one moment in my early 20s where I was talking to one of my parents. I don't even remember, but I remember I was debating and debating and debating. I had this moment of clarity that was like, you know what? I'm done arguing about this. I am going to go live my life as if this new idea that I'm having is true. I'm going to prove these people wrong with my life. I'm going to prove to them that this belief system that they have, not necessarily the whole doctrine, but like this belief that I'm arguing with them about, if that got shifted to this and more true, life would get better. And so I just stopped all of the arguing. I don't argue doctrine, religion, beliefs anymore. And I started asking myself, literally, what would love do right now? What would this look like? What would truth do right now in this situation? How would love raise a child, interact at this point in a marriage that's going through some hard times? And I never did it perfectly, but that was like my guiding light. And it ended up creating a life that was happening for me and not to me. It shifted that enough for me that I was coming home from work telling my husband, like, you will not believe the story that I heard today, this story and this woman, and you won't believe how this showed up in her life at this. Isn't that amazing? Well, my son is overhearing all of those stories. And then I come home and I share, this is what's happening for me. it's almost like that lady's story where because my belief, my identity was expanding as I was interacting with other peoples who were a little bit further ahead than me in certain ways, pulling me forward. And it was pulling him forward because I was sharing it. And so he was able to like really not just articulate that, but understand in reality that that was just a better way to live. And so, eventually we had conversations. And I would say most everything about this young man is essentially Christian, like how I grew up. And he, because when I told them that I was not raising him with the Bible, they gave me their 2 cents about how that was going to go. What happens if you don't raise them right? They don't come back. Give them what is that Bible verse? You raise them and they'll always come back. I wish I could remember. It's not right there, but
I know I'm bad.
Train a child in the way he should go, and he will not depart from it.
Okay,
right. And I remember thinking, yeah, everyone that I saw trained up on that departed from it. Not because it wasn't
you had an antagonistic attitude at the onset. I see, but but you said a couple of things that I really want to go back to because it's very interesting. It appeared to me that as he was forming his own identity, yours was evolving as well.
100%. That was my agreement with him when he got here. Was like, I don't know what I'm doing, so we're gonna have to figure this out together.
Right. But that's an interesting point that I just want to go back to, because a lot of times you hear people say, well, I'm there and I've evolved and I've arrived. But you don't truly arrive because you're continuing to grow and transform as new experiences and new environments and people and connections that you make, they're adding to the person that you truly are to become. Because like you said before, I love what he said is 4. So the 4 is helping you to continue to move ahead, because in true wellness, because our physical bodies and our mental state over time will deteriorate as we get to be older. But what really stays strong is that connection and relationship that we have with the Father that created us. And that's where you continue to grow and become well in him. As I have a friend that says, you become well in him because the things in life, the materialistic things, those things and your health are going to fade away. But that connection will stay there forever if you just nurture it along the way. Yep. And that's what your son is doing. And that's what you have showed him how to do, how he can nurture that on his own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And always be, one of the things that I always think about is how, was it at the burning bush when Moses was there and God said, I am. And it was like, that's it. I am. Like fill in the blank afterwards, but I am. And anything that tries to put God in a box and define it is always going to fall short, because it's always only going to define one part of it. So why not cultivate a mindset, a lens, a way of living and moving and breathing through the world that's like, how is God going to show up today? Is it going to be in a new connection with an amazing human who's up to similar work? Is it going to be in an inspiration for another project or book or offering in my business? Like, it has us always open, instead of, I have my system clearly defined and I know the parameters that are safe, and I'm not going outside of that because, well, I don't know how to exist outside of that, right? That's a closed identity that ends up disintegrating because there's nothing calling it out to grow, to learn that not only is that the God more than we could ever imagine, we are too, right? Like, we're made in that image, and we are called to be so much more than we can even imagine possible. So if we have that sense of identity of like, I'm always going to be figuring out even more, so much more of how God wants to show up in our lives and we don't even notice it. And how much of
that, I would like to term that identity opportunities.
Oh, I like it.
Because that's what it is. It's identity opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I believe every single character, And, I've had really long, hard conversations with people about, my first run through the education system was in a room full of young people whose like all the cards were stacked against them, you
Mm.
know, on race, on economics, on like every single structure that you can imagine, cards stacked against them. And I remember thinking, like, what if they could just see themselves as able to graduate high school? Then maybe they could graduate high school and then maybe be able to see themselves as possibly being able to go to college or
Yeah.
get a good job or maybe even do better than their parents did or whatever that conversation was, but they just could not believe. And I just remember thinking, I would pass out these little notes that were like, you did such a phenomenal job yesterday. I can tell you are so smart. 15 to 18-year-old people in this classroom. And I handed one of them out. I'm handing them out. And their names are on it and their notes. And this girl looks up at me and she just breaks. She just starts bawling her eyes out. And I'm like, oh no, what did I write? Me with the words. I'm usually so careful. And she goes, no one has ever called me smart before.
Oh my goodness. See?
Identity possibility. Yes, you're smart. The person in the front of the room who has been given some sort of authority. I don't know why I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing in that room. Just a person who has a little bit of influence saying, I see that you are this, even though you can't. And something, I mean, I don't know what ended up happening to her because I was at the end of a school year, but I hope that that was like a little seed that, when she found herself in a situation where she wondered if she was smart enough to contend with it, that
Yeah.
she would try.
And that's one of the things that's the pillars for my coaching business is the 3 Bs. Believe in what you just told that young girl that you're smart. All she had to do was believe in that and then become. So she could be maybe a scientist or doctor, lawyer, whatever she wanted to be, but she could become.
Yep.
But then the third B is belonging. Belong to a community that is empowering and uplifting. And so that is what I really that is what I practice in my coaching and in my motivation, my speeches and everything is how can I impart those 3 Bs to the person so that when they leave my presence, they then have the plan in place to apply those 3 Bs.
Yeah, I love it.
You know,
Very empowering.
and I think about your story, the storytelling, because as you tell a story, it helps that person visualize and really release things that don't serve them while embracing the things that help them.
Yep.
Right?
100%. And I think, when you're talking about belonging, one of the most profoundly beautiful experiences that I get to have regularly is being in a community of belonging, of being in a space with people who agree to be safe for each other, to disclose some of the hardest things that some of them have not disclosed to a single other soul before this space.
Yeah.
And that opportunity to not just witness someone liberate themselves from the silence, but to watch the liberation that ripples around the room when they see that happen. Like, if I could tell my story, if I told my story, but I left this part out, you know? And so then on the next turn around the shares, guess what comes out? A little bit more and a little bit more. And it creates this space of seeing who a person really is and everything that actually shaped them. Because I don't think that we can reshape or rewrite an identity without being real, honest, and truthful about what shaped us to begin with. And not just what shaped us, but oftentimes our part in it. When we were kids, what could we really do? I could have tantrumed a little bit more. I could have rebelled a little bit. I could have. And so, up to a certain point, like culpability, there's an imbalance there. But then at some point, I started doing this to myself. I started putting myself in these tough situations. I didn't know any better. I didn't have any better models. I didn't all the reasons, but when someone gets to look at their entire story and what shaped their identity, they get to see everything that happened to them, everything that they did to themselves, and all of the grace that happened in between to just
Mhm.
pull the story forward to help them survive and get to the point where they could be in a room full of safe people and start to really look at that identity and begin to heal it.
Yes. Powerful. You know, I think we have to be willing to be vulnerable and to be authentic. And the thing is that that's what you did with your son. And that's what you're doing in your business today,
Mhm.
because that really has become your passion, the storytelling and helping others to be authentic and vulnerable, to really form and evolve. And that's what we have to understand in life is what you said at the beginning of our talk, is that we don't really have the choices in the beginning. But as you get to be older, you do have a choice. And so you have to take control and responsibility. Otherwise, you'll just continue to just drift along in your life, never
Mhm.
reaching that place of fulfillment and wellness to maximize being that person that you can be in truth in your spirit, mind, and body. And that's what's so important today is
Yeah.
how can we help people get to that place? And how do you need to be open to know that you can get to that place
Mhm.
and don't just settle in
Well,
life?
and sometimes it's just like a sliver of a moment in a day where you actually can see something. Because I've worked with high performing professionals in so many different domains. And I can't tell you the number of times where we'll look at, a day in their life or how this is really sort like what is the current story? And we'll talk it through and they feel powerless at every single juncture. And so the first goal is like, where do you have a moment where you could pretend to have some power? you know? Because some of us have set ourselves up into work situations or relationship situations that are actually very disempowering.
Yes.
And so, in order to change that, it's not something that is a fast, like I have so much power. Yes, you do. But sometimes that power is running to the bathroom at the workplace and doing a quick little mindfulness something to regulate yourself so that you don't get caught up in the rest of that loop for the rest of the day. And
Yes.
maybe that's just enough to start to shift so that when you go back, you can see things or you can feel calmer and respond better. But it's like, trying to find these little. I once had someone sometimes we do these art projects looking at the day in their life. And it was like trying to talk us through her day. And then there was this giant black crayon, like black hole in the middle of her day. And I was like, what is that? You know, talking me through her day. And she was like, I don't know what that is. So she talks me through, and she goes, oh, this must be my job.
Oh, oh my goodness.
Sometimes we don't even know the thing that is suppressing us, oppressing us so much that we feel like we can't liberate ourselves. And we just need a space with safe people to look at it and say, does can someone just sit here with me while I look at this and try to see something that I haven't been able to see before?
Yes.
You know?
So true. I think about myself today. It was funny. I went to run an errand and I was on the phone talking with some people, and then I got an email that I didn't really care for. And so I got a little bit unsettled and I really had an attitude. I was like, I can't believe this. I'm just running off into my own mind. And so I said, now you're going to let this email get to you for the rest of the day. So I was still driving, thinking about it. So I went to Walgreens and I was parking in the lot. And all of a sudden I heard this bump and I went, and this car had hit another car that was parked in the lot. And I said, now see, you could be that person over there. That's a bad moment that you're not going to be able to get over. that little email message that you saw was like trivial.
Right.
Girl, I said, you need to move on. And I just cracked up. So sometimes you just have to laugh. I mean, it wasn't comical, but the fact that, but this car just went over, it was like, boom. And I went.
Yeah. It's just a different angle. I think that's one of the things that, I've been watching a lot of comedians lately. And I think that's one of the things with comedians that they do so beautifully, where they like take a really hard moment and shift their perception of it just enough to be like, isn't that the dumbest thing you ever thought? Like, we do this every day. Isn't that a crazy thing? And while we're doing it, we think it's the most important thing. But, the person who looks at it just a little bit differently and with just a little comedic angle can completely shift that story rather quickly.
Right. Because after that, I said, what you have is not insurmountable and it doesn't make your whole day. Move on. And so that's what we have to understand. And that's what we're talking about. How can we not allow our experiences to control us, but instead take them in and allow them to be part of our identity and helping us to really live in our true person, in our true self, and finding that place. So is there one parting thought you'd like to leave us with, Amanda?
I would say look for the things that are happening for you. Just for a day. Just train your eyes on what's happening and how could this possibly be happening for me to move me forward into a better chapter.
I love that, because it says all things happen for your good, and that's even the bad. So if you cannot even take the bad situations and turn them around to see that it's for the good and for your life, then you really are going to miss out on those true nuggets that will help you form into that person that you really, truly need to be to live your life to the fullest.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for being with me today.
Thanks for the conversation. I love these conversations. I'll take this over a little superficial chit chat anytime.
I'm with you, and we could talk all day long, and we will be talking again soon. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of Change Your View, and we'll see you on a future episode.
This concludes this episode of Change Your View. Let this conversation help you navigate life's challenges, emerging from that seemingly endless pause that you are experiencing. Regain command of your own path and resist being boxed in. Visit hsjackson.com for more inspiring and eye-opening discussions. Stop walking in the shadows of other individuals. No longer allow inferior perspectives to brainwash you. Do not be forgotten. You have the authority and power over you. Make the most of your abilities. Thank you for listening. Until next time.